listening to the Construction Big Breakfast, where we give you a hearty serving of insider tips and business strategies to help fuel your day so you can thrive in the construction industry. Now, here's your host, Tip Top Tim Fitch.
Hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Tip Top Tim Fitch, and welcome to the Construction Big Breakfast. Today we're diving into a really interesting conversation around how construction positions itself in terms of public affairs, which I think is going to be a really good debate. There's lots about construction that gets overlooked, and we're going to enlighten everybody today. Anyway, joining me today for this podcast is our special guest, Mathew Godwin. Welcome to the podcast, Matt. Can you give our listeners a little introduction about yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tim. Thanks very much, Ben, for having me. Very happy to be here. My background is in public affairs and politics. I've been in and out of the trenches for more years than I care to think in Canada and the UK. Studied politics and policy at University of Toronto and University College London up the road, where your alma mater is also, Tim.
Yep.
And now working at the Tony Blair Institute, mainly on foreign policy and international affairs, but always had an interest in innovation and economic growth. And so it's a huge pleasure to be here to talk about how construction fits into that.
Great. Matt, it's great to have you here today. The first question, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the subjects today, is of course what we ask everyone else.
Yeah.
What did you have for breakfast today?
It depends on if you're asking what do I want or what does my wife want. What my wife wants for breakfast is what I have from Monday to Friday, which is the fruit shake with the bananas, the avocados, the frozen berries. Forget it. I'm going to live for 500 years. But on the weekend, that's my world and that's my domain. So then we have our variation on the English breakfast, which is bacon, sausage, eggs, toast. We usually have some sort of fruit with it, but that's the main jam. But we don't do the fried tomato. I can't get on board with the fried tomato. I'm sorry to say, boys.
No, I'm with you there. No tomato with my breakfast. Definitely not.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no tomato. Sorry, not tomato.
Two tomatoes. Talking about accommodation of newcomers.
Well, there are some linguistic differences, we know.
Yeah.
Well, I know what I had today, because today I'd get up especially early, because I had to come to the office relatively early. I went to the gym first.
Oh, come on.
When I got back, my wife had prepared for me an egg and bacon roll with brown sauce.
Go on.
That's exactly what happened.
I'm impressed. Well played.
Go on, Ben. Over.
Yeah, well, no, I was sort of late getting up, but that meant that I had a quick stop at Greg's on the way to the train, so I had a bacon wrap and a latte.
You guys are having much more fun than I am.
Now, remind me, red or brown?
Red every day.
Divides the world. Red or brown
Red or
sauce?
brown? Red.
Sauce. Red.
Yeah.
Okay, moving swiftly on, not brown, of course. Moving swiftly on. Anyway, Matt, it's great to have you.
Yeah,
Thanks for
appreciate
coming in. So, we had, reason we asked you to come on, we had a chat, I think it was started in the House of Lords.
As everything does.
It starts in the House of Lords. I mean, I'll tell you what, we are filming this. Boris is currently the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Although this is the day after all the resignations started.
Yeah.
And anything could happen.
Yeah, totally.
So by the time this goes out,
who knows?
We don't know.
I mean, my perspective on this is that it feels like the guys in the Tory backbenches that wanted to oust the Prime Minister last month, you had the confidence vote, the 1922 committee, I don't understand why they didn't wait until the by-election results in Tiverton and Wakefield. Because obviously it wasn't a very good night for the Prime Minister. I think that the result could have been very different had that confidence vote been held after the by-election. So, I mean, if you're going to oust somebody, then do it at the right time, I guess. We might not be having this conversation, but now things are moving on quite a bit more rapidly, aren't they?
Hopefully.
They look like it's very
rapid. Change coming.
It's very rapid.
Indeed.
But anyway, when we were at the House of Lords, this was after the confidence vote, I can't remember, but we had this conversation around, because this podcast is obviously all about construction, and we're heavily into construction one way or another.
Yeah.
And I think what the conversation's done, well, it gets knocked a lot for the things that it's not so good at. But it certainly doesn't blow its own trumpet, and people don't appreciate how amazing, in my view, I think our collective view, it is for the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be great to explore today about from a political point of view, what's the thinking around construction public affairs?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the interesting thing is that the case, in theory, should be an easy one, right? The numbers are there, 3 million plus jobs, around 10% of the economy. We're talking close on 400 billion value in terms of the sector. Is that right, broadly?
Well, and that's not including some of the indirect spend that happens in manufacturing, in hotels and everything, because it's such a transient labour force moving around the UK. So it's probably a lot more than that. Really delve into the numbers properly.
Yeah, totally. And I guess one of the challenges, I suppose, with the sector is the capturing from a quantitative perspective the output and in terms of labor and everything else, because of the nature of, let's face it, a bit of transience and companies coming in and coming out of the sector. It's not as if you've got these ancient corporations like you have in insurance or banking that sit with.
But they're also it's highly disaggregated.
Right.
So there are some old businesses.
Sure.
Graham's is over 200 years old.
Sure.
is 150.
Sure.
But each of those turnovers less than a billion.
Yeah, right.
Graham's grown quite quickly now.
Yeah.
After 200 years.
Yeah.
But so it hasn't. It's not like there's a giant business that dominates the sector, or even
precisely.
2 or 3. There are some
Precisely.
very large businesses, but
Yeah.
they never account for more than a few percent
Yeah.
total. That's perhaps part of the problem. I think the other thing where construction is really interesting is the industry itself is highly cyclical.
Yeah.
And it's subject to massive variations in demand.
Yeah.
So, for instance, between a boom and a bust, which can happen overnight in construction, because as soon as confidence goes in the economy, all of the private sector stuff gets turned off.
Yeah.
And we hear it a lot from our clients, architects, that phone rings, someone says, stop spending money.
Yeah, shovels out of the ground, sorry folks.
Well, stop drawing.
Yeah.
Don't need that building, we're going to delay it 18 months, see how the world changes.
Yeah.
And the way construction organises itself is it can cope with those huge and very fast variations in demand without throwing hundreds of thousands of people onto the dole.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's astonishing that it can do that, but it can.
Yeah.
And obviously it can contract very quickly. It can't grow quite as fast, but it can grow much faster than the economy as a whole.
Which is probably one of the, it's almost like a perverse advantage in the sense because of that, the nature of the business and it's almost the self-reliance of the sector, maybe government doesn't feel as moved to engage to an extent from a public policy standpoint. Is that fair? Like, as in, it's not like the healthcare sector that says we need X billion dollars every year to meet the demands of the service and to meet the demands of the patient's group.
But what the healthcare sector needs are more hospitals, better hospitals,
Indeed.
and other things that they are then reliant on the construction industry
sector.
for.
Yeah.
So this is where when you talk policy, roads, railway, schools, healthcare, it's all in some way, shape or form relying on us as an industry performing. And the hospital in Birmingham was in the news yesterday. I don't know if you saw the one, the Carillion dropped, when it went bust. It's been delayed again by another 2-3 years.
Yes, I did see that.
So again, we're not shining ourselves as an industry particularly well there. But at the same time, it feels that there's something missing in terms of that joined up strategic thinking at policy level between the different sectors and how construction influences it.
Because there's no doubt that construction relies directly and indirectly on government investment in infrastructure and social infrastructure. So hospitals would be a very good example, but everything around you that's to do with infrastructure, whether it's roads or buildings, that's government money.
Yeah, there's government sort of from a procurement standpoint, but then going back to this point, it's almost like there's not a supply and demand problem in many instances. There's demand, of course, when you think about housing, and there's enormous demand for housing at the moment, in particular affordable housing, which the country is nowhere near meeting the goals and targets that it's set out for itself to meet. And then there's the supply, which is a extremely large, incredibly vibrant sector that's willing to meet the needs that the government and obviously the population are setting out. But clearly something in the middle is not working. the sort of black box that you call it in terms of public policy. The dots are not being connected. You could talk about regulation, you could talk about any number of other things.
No,
but
I will try and sort of defend the conversation in part so that we don't upset all our viewers, because there are some really good things that are happening. You know, the Construction Playbook, the Value Toolkit. There's some really good conversations that are happening. You know, things like the Building Safety Act. You know, Mr. Wilmot Dixon doesn't particularly like it, according to yesterday's news. But in general, when certain things are required, we can sort of work together. But since the construction was an individual, I forgot what the name of the title was. There used to be an individual who was sort of the linchpin and the go-between between government and industry, the chief government advisor or something like that.
That's right. It was abolished after, I think it's been abolished. Peter Hansford was the last.
The last one who had it full time.
Yes.
I think one of the MPs who quit last night had it as like his third most important role, which makes no sense, does it, for something that is so important to the industry.
But going back to that point that you made about the, building hospitals and the priority that governments have to place in construction as a mechanism for delivering the promises basically that they're making to constituents. I mean, is the issue less about making the case for construction as a sector, but insinuating almost construction as a sector into bigger challenges society is facing? So there's huge amounts of issues around productivity. We know there have been challenges in the construction sector in general about that, maybe a bit more than other sectors, but this country in general, compared to other countries, is not doing what it should be when it comes to productivity. There's issues around export growth, and then I mentioned housing earlier. Is it about inserting construction sector as a part of the answer to these larger challenges, rather than sitting down and saying, let's talk about construction?
I think there's an interesting thread developing there, because construction consumes lots of government cash.
Sure.
But you get an output which is tangible and is there for 50 or 100 years.
Which MPs like.
Right?
Yeah.
So rather than like healthcare, which is you put lots of money in and people live a bit longer. Yeah. Which is tangible, but it's not quite the same as saying, oh look, there's a new bridge.
Yeah, you can't
or
take
there's a new housing estate, which is going to provide housing for 100 years, and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So the thing about construction, because it's so reliant on government money, a lot of it is public procurement as well.
Yeah.
There is a big move, and Ben's passionate about this, around procuring for value, and where a lot of the values in the eye of the beholder is some form or a number of forms of social value. Mm-hmm. Ben can wax lyrical on this. And the construction in a way has got no choice but to respond to that if they want to win these larger, more sophisticated projects, and they are. Yeah. And so therefore it ends up being these government policies start getting enacted by the construction sector because it's mandated through the procurement process. So I mean, you've got those examples.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Construction creates so much social good, so much social value. There are great examples of well-built schools creating better educational outcomes for grades, improving hospitals as well. New hospitals generally are better, less infections and all that. And since the Social Value Act started impacting construction, people are starting to think about, well, what does that really mean in terms of outcome? I think where the disconnect it happens. So the policies are already enacted, and then it's like, well, how do you answer? If we turn it to a sort of a more traditional construction conversation, we start talking about early contractor involvement. It's early industry involvement.
Good parallel.
You think about the climate change crisis. Yeah. So we're talking about creating net zero buildings and some great stuff to reduce embodied carbon. But there seems to be a little bit more of a disconnect between refurbishing the existing housing stock, which is the bebiggest creator of carbon that we have in the country.
Just 40% of energy use.
And things like the Green Deal and stuff like that. It starts and it finishes quite quickly because they realise the policy doesn't quite work right. And the industry isn't quite built right to do it. There's almost a need to have some way of influencing earlier.
Yeah.
The intent is good in policy,
Yeah.
and the industry could probably do it, but it's not the most efficient way of going about the conversation.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, when the government is talking about the Green New Deal, the net zero commitment, the climate change approach, the COP that we just had here last year, when you look around the table in terms of conversations that sectors and really, I think, historically activists are having, which is totally fair, with government about the climate agenda, I mean, how often are seats taken up by the construction sector? Going back to the other point that I was making in terms of it's not necessarily about bringing politicians around the table to talk about construction. It's about making sure the sector is at the table when politicians are talking about these issues that are critical. That I shouldn't say the issues are critical. The construction is critical to resolving the issues. That's the argument for me. That is the principal argument. If you want to get this done, if you want to meet your COP targets, if you want to meet your affordability or housing affordability targets, the construction sector has to be at the table from target setting phase, let alone implementation, I would think. Yeah?
No, I agree with you. I'm not. Ben, you may know the detail better than me. Isn't the Construction Leadership Council sort of trying to is doing that or trying to do that?
Yeah, there are and the RIBA, ICE, they all have opportunity to influence.
Yeah.
It's the opportunity provided at the right time, at the right level, and
Sure.
to enough people.
Sure.
Because there'll be a lot of people around that
Trying to
table
yeah.
trying to influence things for sometimes their own sort of political sort of requirements and good. But is it then losing, and is the influence enough?
Yeah.
Are we talking in enough ears?
The other way to look at this too, and it's quite interesting, is the role of holding government to account. So going back to the housing affordability stock and supply, I mean, a lot of the people that traditionally work to hold the government to account these types of commitments are, rough sleeping advocates, shelter advocates, etc. I mean, does the construction sector, should it play a role, I wonder, in that sort of accountability process, which is to say, you committed to build this many homes, we're ready to start building. Where's the leadership? You know what I'm saying? Or is that not the role?
There's a slight house building is not construction.
Right.
It's a different business model. It involves construction, but house builders are typically, their key skills are to do land assembly, planning, development, and marketing and selling houses. The construction bit is a third of the cost.
Yeah.
Probably a third of the value, less than a third of the value. The value is created by assembling the land and getting planning consent. And they're built at the right time, which is in marketing.
But nevertheless, an important component of it.
Of that bit, yes, because you do need, if you suddenly say we want to build, I know where we're at now, 170,000 houses a year, it should be 250,000.
Yeah.
Then the real constraint is the skills to do the building bit, because the land is already bought.
Yeah, sure.
In many cases, you've got planning consent.
Yeah.
So the question is the demand? We know the demand's there, but can they pay for it?
Right.
And the other one is we've actually got to build the physical thing.
Sure, that's the essence of the game.
So there's all of that going.
Yeah.
And construction's got a part of that. They can't affect the ability for people to buy the thing when it's built.
No, indeed.
And they're not involved in assembling the land and running a house building business, which is different from being a constructor.
But people's ability to buy, I think, comes down to government policy when it comes to affordable housing, isn't it? I mean, you can't have these
also market forces. Yeah, exactly.
Market forces, indeed. But I think the whole,
availability that type of thing.
Which is especially important now, given the cost of materials, given the cost of transport, which is of enormous concern to the sector, and the reality that many people increasingly can't afford to build or buy a house, isn't it?
I mean, there's again in the news this week, was it the idea of 50-year mortgages so that you can hand your mortgage to your children? I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't want my parents' mortgage arriving at some point in my lifetime. I think it was an interesting, although it's a similar model in Germany, I think.
I live in Chiswick. It'll be a 500-year mortgage, but go on.
But yeah, you're right. So in Germany, people don't buy a house till they're 40. something like that.
Yeah.
So it's much different from the UK. In different perspective, the rental sector's a large part.
Yeah.
And most people rent.
Yeah.
I think one of the potential reasons for the disconnect is I do think that there's an issue sometimes. Some of the things, especially when you come to real infrastructure change, the Elizabeth Line, new power stations, these
flagship projects.
Flagship. Take a lot longer than 5 years.
Yeah, for sure.
And certainly will not make a positive impact in the first 2 years of anyone's term.
Yeah.
So I think there is an
short-termism
that unfortunately is a requirement of the sort of democratic process that we have. You know, if we lived in a dictatorship, I reckon the industry would be great.
Yeah, Xi Jinping can turn up
exactly.
No problem. Yeah, the new dam is there. 10 years from now, no
look
problem.
at all the railway they've built in China.
No, absolutely right. I mean, you look at these hot, Olympic and big sporting event construction windows are perfect examples of that, isn't it? Like, Vladimir Putin during the Sochi Olympics and during the World Cup was able to. I mean, that was a real. Speaking of Russia, Ukraine, I was just reading something about his. That was a great moment for him in showcasing Russia, and was this infrastructure that was provided as a consequence of the World Cup. And I think that for someone like him who can think decades along the line about political outcomes, that's absolutely fine. But for politicians, they're either at the beginning putting the shovel in the ground, or they're cutting the red tape at the end of it. And it's just who happens to be there, effectively, isn't it?
But no one's done it better than London. I think 2012 is still the flagship for
no one has done it better.
Regeneration of an area.
2012 for me, the post-war moment for Britain was 2012. I think that was the moment this country really was at its most confident. Golden Jubilee, Olympics. It was an amazing moment, wasn't it? And it was all because of construction and infrastructure. That was what drew people together and brought people together.
On that note.
Yeah.
On that note, let's wrap up this conversation.
What?
Because we've done 35 minutes already.
No.
I told you to go quick. You see, talking about construction, you seem to lose track of time. That's been unbelievably insightful, Matt. We've had a really great conversation. Maybe we'll have to have you back. We'll do another one.
I think
we'll do it when we've got the new Prime Minister. And thanks for joining me today. Where can the listeners get in touch with you if they want to learn more or follow up with you?
I mean, I'm happy to, maybe you can put my email on the website. Happy to have people reach out to me on Twitter, the whole bit.
We'll put it all in the show notes.
I'll
home address.
Except for home address, I'll accept for Facebook, because my family had gotten a bit wild on Facebook, and I've decided there's I can't do it anymore, so it'll be Twitter, email, or
whatever you want. We'll put it on the show notes.
No problem.
So wonderful. To all of our listeners today, thank you for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Construction Big Breakfast. We have a new episode every week or so click the subscribe button, which will be down there somewhere. Turn your notifications on so you don't miss a single episode. While you're at it, we'd appreciate a 5-star review. And if you enjoyed this episode today, please like it and share it, as that helps us reach more listeners. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast or looking to collaborate in other ways, visit our website, which is invent.com. The link's in the description. Fill out the contact form and one of my team will be in touch. So, see you next time.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Construction Big Breakfast. Make sure to visit our website, www.inventt.com, where you can subscribe to the Construction Big Breakfast on all platforms so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a positive rating. Or if you'd simply share it with a friend, that would help us out too. Be sure to tune in for our next episode.